Now, this is our first full day of retreat, of a very special retreat, maybe a very straight retreat, but it is as it is. And yesterday I spoke about the frame. There's a certain frame that can create conditions for the retreat, like taking precepts, like not talking or talking as little as possible, depending, like having a certain schedule, at least certain points through the day where we practice or we meet, then times where you practice on your own. Also restraining from things we usually would do. I find it quite difficult to look into the email box and then finding emails and not opening them. Or maybe it's even possible not to look into for some days. So things get less, activities get less and give more space for a more dedicated and concentrated kind of practice. I think this is first what is necessary, this kind of frame. And of course, in this situation, for everyone here, it will be different. Some are in full retreat, some are on part-time retreat. But still, it's important to keep an eye on what frame are you creating for yourself, and is it helpful? Or are there areas where you still can change something, be more strict or be less strict? You have to find out. It's a kind of experiment. What helps me here in this retreat, and what helps in mindfulness and in concentration. I'm not sure if all the mics are off. I heard some sounds from Sardinia. It was anyway nice nature sound. Okay, thank you. So what I want to talk about today is, why do we practice? I think this is something that is worthwhile to reflect upon. I mean, it's quite something to decide to do an online retreat at home. But why? And sometimes this is clear to us, but sometimes it may not be clear to us, especially when we practice and the first difficulties arise and we see it might not be that easy all the time. Then this question may arise again that says, why am I doing this? Why am I doing this? Why am I practicing? So that's more the voice of doubt. So, and this does arise usually at times. We mostly cannot avoid it. So for this, it is important to, when there is no doubt, when we are quite clear, to reflect upon that. Why am I practicing? What is my inner motivation? And there may be different inner motivations. I would like to offer a few inner motivations that one would come across. One in the Buddhist text. There is a quite well-known sutta or discourse of the Buddha, where there is described where a young man who has a good life, living in a good family, in a wealthy family, is leaving the house to practice meditation, and even to step into the order of monks of the Buddha, quite a big step. And he was questioned once by some very influential person, some kind of small king or so. He said, "Why did you do this step? You had everything." And then this influential person was quoting something that seemed to be among people at this time, that he said, "Well, you didn't have any of the four kind of loss." Four kind could be a reason that one starts practicing, that one starts to think about maybe deeper meaning in life. That a kind of loss that people can awake somehow from a dreamlike life, automatic life. He said, you didn't have this loss. First loss through aging. So what is one losing? One is losing youth. One is using a kind of maybe strength and fidelity. But you also did not lose anything through illness. That's an interesting one, because actually in a very strange and different way, we are affected through that. We are maybe not ill, but we lost at the moment quite a lot of freedom and possibilities because of illness going around the globe and to our countries. So suddenly it's a completely different situation and not possible to meet in the meditation center, for example, or to travel freely. Okay. So he didn't have such a loss. He also didn't have a loss of wealth. That's the fourth kind of loss that is mentioned. And no loss of relatives. It's the fourth one. Through aging, through illness, wealth, and relatives. So then this young man said, yes, no, I didn't have all of these kinds of loss, but I just reflected in my mind. And I had a few reflections. And that's an interesting point, because sometimes we kind of awaken just through reflecting and thinking. And sometimes we need life to really knock on the door in a very painful way. So this man said, well, I just reflected. And I reflected four kinds of things. And he called it the four summaries of the Dharma, of the truth. The world is swept away, it doesn't endure, is the first. So the reflection was, there is change, everything is changing, there is nothing we can really hold on to. Then he would reflect, the world is without shelter. So similar to that, there is nothing we can really permanently forever rely on outside. Then the world is without ownership. One has to pass on, leaving everything behind. So whatever we own, at some point one has to leave it. And then would say the world is it is slightly different as reflection. The world is insatiable, a slave to craving. I mean, it's not the world, but the craving is in our minds and hearts. And this is what the Buddha would call actually the true source of suffering, of mental suffering. Craving to something that we cannot crave to because it is changing, because it is not completely reliable, because we can't own it. So these reflections about the Dharma, about things, how things are in life on a very deep level, made this person to seek for something more reliable, to seek insight. So that could be one uh, that could be one reason why to practice. Kind of inner pilgrimage for some people, not for everyone. For me, for example, it was not such deep reflections. It was not such inner pilgrimage. Well, somehow. Because when starting to practice, I read a book of Ramakrishna, a say holy person or living in Calcutta in India. And he was the priest of just one temple in India, in Calcutta. And he never left the place. He was usually always around in this area. And his whole life around this temple. But what he discovered is what he described in his book, or it's a book about his life, this kind of inner pilgrimage, inner traveling. And this was kind of giving some resonance in me. There is some inner pilgrimage. There is a possibility to travel inwardly. And traveling in the sense that one is exploring new areas, exploring this body, exploring this mind, exploring the heart. But not just that, but also exploring new possibilities. What can grow? What can change to the worse or to the better? And exploring ways how the heart, mind can change even to the better. And that doesn't happen by willpower, but and this is Vipassana. It's an exploration, and change comes only through insight and wisdom and observation. This is why mindfulness is so important, to explore and to tap into the resources, the wholesome resources we have, and to kind of foster them so that they can grow. So an inner pilgrimage. For some, it's a kind of inner seeking, and they don't even know what they seek. That's sometimes, for some people, something underlying. I once read this text, if I find it. It's by a Christian sage, Saint Augustine. The restless heart is the root of pilgrimage. In human beings lives a longing that draws one out and away from the day-to-day life and the restrictions of one's usual surroundings. Always allures the other, the unknown. But everything new that he sees on the way never can satisfy him completely. His longing is bigger. At the bottom of his heart, he searches restless for the eternal home. Anyway, we have to search at home. We can't go out, we can search at home. For other people, it's very, very simple reasons to practice. For me, when I started practicing meditation, it was a very simple reason. And the reason was that I felt I have to stop the kind of life I was living because it was very unwholesome and it was uh, when I was 20, 23, 24, and I felt that if I keep the company of these people and if we continue to live this kind of fun life, which is actually destructive, it wouldn't be good. I thought, okay, maybe do something opposite. Go and meditate and go far away. So I could go to Sri Lanka and then meet a monastery and stay there and practice there. And then just it slowly the depths of practice got clear. So it was just a kind of, well, I can't go on like this, maybe try that. So that can be a reason. So what I would like to suggest is just to pause for a moment and reflect for yourself. Why am I doing this? Why am I practicing meditation? Why am I joining this retreat? And there may be an answer, there may be no answer, maybe later. Or there's an answer without words. Why am I really doing this? There are also other benefits that can come from the Vipassana practice. And usually when I give a talk on Vipassana meditation to a general audience, not in the retreat, of course, I also would name a certain benefits where it can lead to, or what difference it can make. And this can be very day-to-day life related um, benefits. Here. Okay. So one benefit I would uh, mention is that one can learn through mindfulness to kind of disidentify and not to be caught completely into all kind of thoughts, into all kind of emotions, and there arises a perspective that can be with it without being 100% drawn into it. And that gives some space. That gives some sense of freedom. And I don't know how it was on the first day, because it could be that one was drawn a lot into thinking, a lot into emotions, or a lot into reacting to pains or whatever, or just the wandering mind or the sleepy mind. I don't know. Maybe I hear from some of you tomorrow when we have the so-called interviews. But there might be also some moments of realizing what is actually going on. And then there arises this perspective that is simply watching on. And in the beginning, sometimes it's just moments. For example, this afternoon when I was sitting with the second sitting, which was not online, I also do this as far as possible, a kind of practicing with you without knowing and seeing what others do. That there was a sitting where I tried to be, as I say to you, be with the body. There is a body. The body is breathing. But then most of the time there was no attention of breathing. There was just blah, blah, blah. What can I do? What can I say this evening, and so on. And then sometimes remembering, there's a body. And the mind was going to the body, but it was not going to the breathing. It was just tight body. So in the beginning, there was this idea, okay, but now go to the breathing. But at some point, stepping back and seeing, oh, there's just tight body. Okay. And that's a moment of mindfulness. Just the tight body. And nothing to do with it or nothing to change. One has to change. This is a moment of mindfulness. And this creates some space. I can be just with the now tight body. And if I cling to, I should be with the breathing, should be with the relaxed body, this already creates a subtle kind of suffering that is even more unpleasant than just being open and feel, it's just tight body. So this is little things, but it makes quite a difference. So that's one possibility of being able to kind of stepping back, but not dissociating completely in the sense of pushing something away, just this little step back and see what's actually going on there. And here we have to be careful because we get, I gave an instruction this morning, and I gave instruction that the primary object is the breathing or the rising and falling. So then one often would think, but I'm not with the breathing, should be with the breathing, and overlooking what is actually happening. So stepping back, seeing what happens. And then from that point, well, maybe it's possible now to connect with the breathing. And if not, then okay, what else is there? Tight body, for example. So this stepping back. It can also happen with emotions, that one might be completely in the emotion, or one may be able to step back and see, there is anger, there is sadness. It's still there, but it's not 100% taking me. There is some instance that can observe what's going on. And the same with thoughts. There are thoughts, there might be a lot of thoughts, but maybe after some time, in the beginning for meditators, don't have too high expectations. In the beginning, it might be that one is for a few minutes in a train of thoughts. And then you realize it, thinking. So that is when this space is created that can see, that's going on. And this also gives the possibility to choose, to rather chew on these thoughts. And you may have already also had this experience that you would wake up and there are thoughts, but there is no will to let go of them because they're nice, because they are entertaining or whatever, and just go on with them. Or you could choose to say, okay, I let go of them, but I shift the attention back to there's a body breathing. There's some choice there. But if there is no awareness, there is not even choice. It just goes on by itself. So that is another benefit of the practice, that one has more choices. Which direction do I want to take? What do I want to nourish? What do I not want to nourish? And there's a lot of opportunity during the retreat to have experience with that. What in your mind is worth nourishing? What in the mind and heart is not worth nourishing? But sometimes I still nourish it. So it's also important to see, how do I nourish these negative emotions, for example? Or how do I nourish restlessness? Or whatever. So this can happen with more and more mindfulness. Well, there are quite some other benefits. But I would like to quote still something that relates to this being able to remove oneself and observe what's going on. So this kind of inner exploration. And I would like to quote a woman that I I venerate. I don't know her personally, but I have read a few books. And this is Tenzin Palmo, who an English woman who became a Tibetan Buddhist nun, and she was living quite some time ago for 12 years in a cave in the Himalayas. And after that, out of the cave came a wise woman. And she's teaching around the world now. So I said, your cave is not in the Himalayas. Your cave is the room where you can close the door behind. And I don't know if she was lucky to have her own cave, because it was a hard life there on 4,000-meter high height, even being there at winter. Anyway, she writes in one of her books about this removing and onlooking, creating space to look on. When we start to practice in this way, it seems at first that there is a split in our mind happening. We develop this, what we call the observer, the witness, the knower. This is one aspect of the mind, but it is still just mind, conceptual mind, but also mind, that removes itself and observes what happens, like from a certain distance. In itself, this is not absolute truth, as it still is conceptual mind. But it is a big development compared to the way we usually think, because it creates the space, it gives space to see a thought as a thought, an emotion as an emotion. Then we can decide whether it is a useful thought or a useful emotion or not. We see it as this what it is, instead of getting caught by it. We don't identify any longer with it. So what she writes here is that it first creates kind of observer. But this is just a concept, she says. And so in, say, more Theravada Buddhist language, one would say, well, there is no observer, but there is observing. There is onlooking. It's a process. And we're kind of trying to nourish this process of being able to observe more and more and more what's going on in this body and mind. Another quite advanced benefit of the practice is that more and more inner balance can arise. And sometimes it is called equanimity, in the sense of even if pleasant and unpleasant experiences are changing and are not controllable by us, one is relatively in balance with them, and they are not having so much impact. One can stay quite awake and balanced. And this is not happening by will, but it can happen through the practice. Oh, and another, I think is a very important benefit that can arise from the practice is that simply we learn to open. We learn to open to ourselves. We learn to open to our inner life. We also learn to open to our darker parts, to our wounds. We learn to open to the joys. we learn to open to the whole range of outer and inner experience. And when we learn to open to our inner experience, also to the more difficult ones, then it, and being able to be with it, to embrace it, not to fight it, then this is a very, very, very important resource to have. Because then it also is easier to open to other people who might have difficult experience, to open to others suffering, or or at least being able to think ourselves into other people. And that's where compassion arises, where we can really hold compassion with other beings without feeling threatened by difficult things and experiences. Well, of course, the practice can also generate joy, it can generate calmness, it can make us a little bit more centered. It can, of course, also show us how little we are centered. And that's something that often starts in the beginning. I remember that my first teacher in Sri Lanka would say after the first day, he said, "Poor meditator, poor meditator. First, when you came to practice, you had no problem with thoughts. Now you have problem with thoughts." Because many people say, "Oh, there's so much thinking, it's going on all the time," and so on. Before you didn't have a problem, now you have a problem with thoughts. Poor meditator. But what it shows is just that you're kind of um, switching on a light. And this light shows what's going on. And it's not different than usual probably, but it's just that we start seeing it. So we see how the mind is chatting, or how it is always on the move. Seeing what happens, simply, just like this. That's mindfulness. Seeing, observing what happens while it happens is one of the definitions. So whatever the purpose of your practice is, or whatever the motivation is, sometimes it might be helpful to remember it. Sometimes in times when it feels it goes quite difficult to remember it. To connect or reconnect with your motivation. And there will be times where it is difficult, where time seems not to pass, where it might be uh, in certain ways painful, but also, and when we never know, the next moment can be completely different. So again, important is to be patient and persevering in the practice. And sometimes just putting the body there and keeping it there for some time is already rising a certain kind of energy. And with the days, and I have the complete trust in that, development happens. And I have the trust that this is also happening in all the meditators here, if they are uh, keeping a certain frame. So I spoke about one of the tools or qualities that one is developing in the practice of Vipassana meditation, and that's mindfulness. And I have uh, uh, spoken about this aspect of mindfulness that kind of creates some space to look on, to see what's going on. This is why in the texts, in the old Buddhist texts, there are a few images given for mindfulness. You find these images in a few suttas, not too many. Or in one text which is uh, called the Text of Enlightened Monks. There's another text of Enlightened Nuns. But that image that I'm just showing now is in one of these texts of the Enlightened Monks. And one of them, he's describing mindfulness like standing down on what is going on down there. That shows this kind of being slightly removed and there is some space. But one should here really not misinterpret that, because there's a kind of removing where we keep something away. And this is why it is also important to have in mind that there is another aspect of mindfulness together with concentration, uh, where it is said that mindfulness can penetrate an object. And that's interesting. It's not just removed, it can penetrate an object. And this one can play with, or even have the courage to do that. For example, when there is a certain difficult sensation in the body. And there, often one would rather try to remove. Okay, I watch it, but I watch it from far away from my watchtower. But there is a kind of uh, keeping it away, a kind of aversion. So what one could try with this or with anything else, kind of jump into it. And here another image is given in a secondary text that mindfulness can also be compared with a stone thrown into water, and it is sinking into the water. It is sinking into the object. And it is not, in this text says it's not like some cork. I think in English you can say cork, that what you have on the wine bottle. And if you throw it into water, what happens? It doesn't sink. It will be just on the surface. Yeah. So I find that interesting, these two different images, that the one of observing from the distance, the other of just sinking into. But the interesting thing is sinking into can then even again create a certain space, but that's then the effect of it. And then we're back to the possibility of spacious observation. Anyway, a second image that is given for mindfulness is that of a doorkeeper at the gate of a city. And there is a wall around the city, and there's one door, and there's a doorkeeper. And there it is said, this doorkeeper, he looks and knows everyone who comes and wants to go in and out. And he looks into the face of the persons, and he knows the persons. And then he knows whom he can let in and whom he should not let in. Because this person doesn't belong into the city, or it's a dangerous person. So the doorkeeper here has the function of observing, seeing, but then also of having a choice. if we use this image of the doorkeeper, we could say that now maybe on the first day, this doorkeeper is still in training. He's not yet the perfect doorkeeper, because sometimes he's asleep, sometimes he thinks of other things, he doesn't always see who is passing. But we're kind of training the doorkeeper so that there are more and more mindful moments or phases. But this doesn't happen with pushing and willpower. It is just, and this is a very important attitude. The practice develops not through willpower. And if you feel it's not really developing as you have the idea, it's not something that you can just do by willpower. And it's not something that you can take by, maybe I'm not able to do it or whatever. It's just kind of creating conditions. We are creating conditions that something can grow. And this is why, again, in texts there are images given like, well, this practice is like the work of a farmer to plant seeds. Every moment of mindfulness is a seed for more and more mindfulness. And then it is like one is maybe putting out weeds, or one is uh, watering the plants. And then it takes time and it takes circumstances that the plants are growing. In the same way, the practice and mindfulness, and concentration and wisdom take some time to grow. And we're kind of creating the conditions. Also with your practice today, you are creating conditions for the practice tomorrow. And then you create conditions for the practice day after tomorrow. And with the time, growing can be observed in its own time. So mindfulness, it's even when I speak about benefits of practice, mindfulness is not about getting anywhere. Mindfulness is a kind of arriving here and now. It's not about improving something. It's just knowing what happens right here. Mindfulness is not understanding through analyzing and speculating. It is the simple, bare awareness of what happens now. So in a sense, this is not that easy because we have our conditioning of doing things, of controlling things, of wanting to be perfect. But mindfulness is this kind of stopping and just seeing what happens. And this, you can maybe observe this even with such simple thing like being with the breath, or being with the rising and falling of the abdomen. That sometimes it's so hard to just be with it, because there is this mind that says, oh, it should be like this. I should breathe more in the abdomen than I do, or my breath should be longer, or my breath is a little bit too tight. It shouldn't be so tight. That's not mindfulness. That's kind of wanting something. So stepping back and just allowing it as it is without making a big story out of it. This would be a moment of mindfulness. Just hearing, just sensations, just thoughts, just walking, just breathing, just this breath, however it is. So for this, arriving again and again just in the simplicity of this moment as it is. And this sometimes needs a reminder. This is how it is now. And just that. I have a nice poem, if I find it now, in this chaos. Yes. It's a poem that someone gave it to me. I wrote it down, but I didn't write down by whom it is. So now I always say it's by the unknown author, but everyone else probably knows the author. I don't know it. Maybe you know. Anyway, it's a nice poem. I quote it even without knowing the author. I am not the author. It says, stop. Stop in the midst of many questions. Stop in the midst of many worries. Stop in the midst of many fears. In the midst of your life, every day anew. Because the words that gives you courage, you can't tell it to yourself. Because the hope that carries you, you can't give it to yourself. Because the love that gives you wings first has to be kindled within you. Stop so that all this can happen. I like this. The word that gives you courage, you can't tell it yourself, you can't force it. It's a process where something is arising by itself because we do this stopping, observing, being present with whatever there is. And this creates the conditions that love, that metta, that wisdom can grow in its own pace. I should look at the time, and I don't have a time. Yeah. Oh, so it's good to look at the time. So mindfulness. This is the heart of this practice, to develop mindfulness. Mindfulness is sometimes defined in such and such a way. It's difficult to define it, but to taste it, then it's more than just abstract words. But there are some definitions that I find quite interesting because they highlight just an aspect of mindfulness. One of them is by Joseph Goldstein, a very well-known meditation teacher in America. He says, mindfulness is the quality of the mind that knows that which is present without judgment and without any intervention. It is like a mirror which clearly mirrors what arises in front of it. So he has this image of the mirror, and the mirror doesn't add anything, a mirror doesn't take anything away, it doesn't judge it, it just knows. This is what I mean with stopping. It just knows barely what is there. Bare reality as it is in this moment. And this is sometimes misinterpreted as, oh, I'm only mindful when there is no judging. But I observe always there is judging and there's like, there's dislike, I don't like this, I like this, I want to keep this. But we can be mindful of this too. Just know, there is aversion, there is wanting, there is craving. And then it creates space around this. So nothing we cannot be mindful of, even this reactivity of the mind. Another definition is mindfulness is the observing power of the mind, a power that varies according to the ripeness of the practitioner. And that shows that it's clearly not something given that is always in the same level, but we can train it, we can let it grow. And so what can happen is that we observe that there are just a few moments of mindfulness and a lot of moments of unmindfulness, even in the meditation practice. I don't know what is realistic to say in the beginning. Maybe I can't say how many percent mindful and unmindful. You find out for yourself. So there might be just moments of being present, moments of seeing what's going on, and then there are moments, or maybe longer moments, where we are caught. But every moment of mindfulness is a cause for another moment of mindfulness. So it is said in some Abhidhamma texts that there are two proximate causes for mindfulness to grow. One is to have a clear Wahrnehmung, perception, to have a clear perception. What does this mean? Clear perception means that we look at something and maybe we take it as something superficially, like this example of one is looking at in the half dark, there is a snake lying on the path in the wood. And then you look a second time and a third time, and you see it's not a snake, but it is just some twig that looks like that. Or it could be the opposite. But you look once, twice, you look clearly. That would be strong perception. The second cause for mindfulness is that it is said mindfulness itself is a cause for mindfulness. To have more and more moments of presence and mindfulness will be a cause that they are growing. And then the commentary says mindfulness is also increasing when you are surrounded by mindful people. That's interesting because they kind of remind you. I don't know. At least when we look shortly during meditation and see others are sitting still, at least it looks like they are mindful. So it can remind oneself. Oh. Anything to say about mindfulness? There's much more to say about what practice can be good for, but I think the hour is over, and let's leave it for today. And at what's the time now? Oh, at 8:30 we can have a meditation together, and it will be a short metta meditation, and then it will go on into silence. Yeah. So thank you for listening and being there, and see you. I would